Okay, this is Chapter 8, Section 2, Emerging Political Parties. Your objectives for today are that you should be able to name and describe the two political parties that evolved in the 1790s, explain how the war that began in 1793 between France and Britain created difficulties for the United States, and identify the tax that incited turmoil in western Pennsylvania, and describe the result of the crisis. Okay. In Europe, political parties are very hostile, tumultuous. There's a lot of change, a lot of fighting. What we as Americans over here know about political parties at this point in history is that they aren't generally good. So we're kind of avoiding the official creation of political parties when we ratify the Constitution, even though we have two groups that are really the fathers of the political parties that we'll know today. You have the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists arguing over the ratification of the Constitution. They're not official political parties the way that we know them today, Republicans, Democrats. Okay. Americans were hoping that because we were able to vote, that the best men would always be selected for the job and they would kind of rise to the top. Initially, before we make an amendment to the Constitution, the winner of the presidential election was obviously the president, but then the second place winner would be vice president. So that's like if President Obama's vice president was now going to be Mitt Romney because he came in second place. It seems a little strange because how are you going to have these two people that have very different ideas working together? So eventually that's why we do end up with an amendment to the Constitution that changes the way that the vice president is selected. So at this point in time in your textbook, we have two groups. We have the Federalists. They're also known as the Hamiltonians because Alexander Hamilton will be one of their major leaders. John Adams will be a Federalist as well. Then you have the Democratic Republicans, or the Jeffersonians, or the Madisonians, because Thomas Jefferson and James Madison will be their major leaders as well. And for some reason your textbook wants to cut off Democratic and just call them Republicans, but the Democratic Republicans are not necessarily associated with the Republican Party today. So I think it's better to call them Democratic Republicans or Jeffersonian Republicans. Okay, so these are the major differences between the two parties. The Hamiltonians, or the Federalists, are in support of the merchant class, of bankers, of manufacturers. They want to see industry thrive because they feel that's going to grow our economy. They're pro-British, not only because we have a British heritage in the United States, but also because they know they're going to be trading with the British. The British have seen kind of the Industrial Revolution flourishing over there. They have factories, and we're looking to see some of those same things here in the United States at this point in time. They're pro-elite, meaning the people that are the best are the people that should be ruling the country, the people that should have a say. So intellectually elite, we think that, and until we get to the rise of mass democracy towards Andrew Jackson's time period, only people that own land should be able to vote. Just the best of the best should vote, or have a say in being a representative and running the government. Federalists believe in a strong central government. They have a broad interpretation of the Constitution, meaning that they are loose constructionists, so they're very flexible in their reading of the Constitution. They're in favor of a high protective tariff to kind of hopefully help our economy over here, and in favor of the creation of the National Bank. Jeffersonians, or Democratic Republicans, differ in that they are pro-small farmers. They want independent shopkeepers. They want people that have a stake in their own government, that are going to vote, that the common people can be in charge if they're tied to the country in some way. And the best way for that to happen, according to Jefferson, is for them to be small, independent citizen farmers. They are suspicious of aristocrats. They like I was saying, believe in the common people can rule. So they're in contrast there with the Hamiltonians being pro-elite. They have a strict interpretation of the Constitution, meaning that if it's not specifically stated within the Constitution, it either needs to be amended or it's a right that should fall to the states to decide. So Jeffersonians are pro-states' rights. The states should have power to make decisions on their own. So they're going to oppose the national bank. That's really where the biggest argument between the two groups is going to come into play. Washington, so you might be wondering where Washington kind of falls in between these two groups, and he's pretty much right in the middle. He is not a fan of party politics, and so he kind of just keeps the peace between the two. Jefferson says to him, North and South will hang together if they have you to hang on. You might start to be realizing that these two political parties have already sectional differences that we're going to see come out later when we get to the Civil War. The Federalist Party is going to be really strong in the North and on the East Coast, and the Democratic Republicans are going to be really, really strong in the South. And if you go to that YouTube clip there, you can watch the argument between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson over the creation of the National Bank. Okay, so within our cabinet, we have people from different political parties trying to work together. So you have Jefferson, who's the Secretary of State. You have Hamilton, who's the Secretary of the Treasury. You have John Adams, who's Vice President. You have, generally, I mean, we have Henry Knox and whatnot, but really we're talking about Hamilton and Jefferson trying to get along and work things out. So we're going to have some foreign affairs that are going to kind of highlight their differences. The Democratic Republicans are pro-French, and the Federalists are pro-British, and when we have to interact with these two countries, these two political parties are going to want to lean in opposite ways. So in 1778, we signed the Treaty of Alliance with the French. The French had helped us out in the American Revolution, so we pretty much vowed that we would always, forever, come to their aid if they needed us. In 1789, the French Revolution breaks out in France, and at first, Americans are really excited because now we have another country kind of taking after us and throwing off monarchy, and they're going to establish a democracy, and it's going to be wonderful. But very quickly, the French Revolution turns ugly. We get the Reign of Terror. It's kind of blood in the streets, mobocracy. You have people being executed by guillotine left and right. So it becomes very negative. There's going to be some Americans that are still going to be in support because they're really pro-French, like Thomas Jefferson. The Federalist Party is going to really dislike the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror because they're pro-elites, and a lot of the people that are being targeted as kind of victims of the guillotine are the elites in France. In 1793, France is going to declare war on Britain, and now we're going to have Britain and France kind of testing us out to see who we are going to support. Like I said, Jefferson's going to really push for us to support France. The Federalists are going to really support that we, or push that we support Britain. And George Washington very intelligently decides that we are not in a position in our country to support either. So he issues the Proclamation of Neutrality, which is pretty much a policy of friendliness and impartiality towards both countries. We're not your enemy, but we're not going to get involved. He actually very carefully words the proclamation to not include the word neutrality, as to not offend the French, who would have said, hey, we helped you out, why aren't you guys going to help us? So we have a French ambassador, he'll be known as Citizen Genet, come over into the United States to kind of try to stir up pro-French sentiment and kind of convince Washington to help the French out in this war. Instead of coming into the United States at the capital like he was supposed to, Citizen Genet decides to come in through the Carolinas, go through the South, and kind of go on this tour he makes speeches. If you look at this YouTube clip that I have, at the bottom you'll see, he's making like a dramatic speech, and I think at the end of that clip, or at the beginning of that clip, he guillotines an effigy of someone. I can't remember right now, but kind of dramatic, stirring up people's emotions. Washington, though, very coolly receives Citizen Genet, not very friendly, pretty much tells him that we are going to continue to remain neutral in this conflict. The Genet then goes down to Florida, and or not down to Florida, he tries to secretly raise an army so that they can fight the British and their ally Spain in Florida. But that doesn't really work out for him. New leadership comes to France, and they don't like Genet, and pretty much if Genet returns to France, he's going to be executed. So he actually appeals to Washington for political asylum, and he's granted that, so he's allowed to pretty much live the rest of his life in New York quietly. Okay, in 1793, the British begin attacking American shipping. What's important here is that they're practicing this thing called impressment. So the British would kind of raid a ship, and they would take American sailors and force them to enlist in the British Navy. So it was almost like slavery in a way, because these are American soldiers that don't, they want to go home. They don't want to serve in the British Navy. They're Americans. Many of them are going to remember the American Revolution. So the British are forcing them to be members of the Navy, so pretty much keeping them against their will. In 1794, Washington is going to send John Jay to go negotiate so that the British will stop doing this. Also, the British haven't done everything they were supposed to do according to the Treaty of Paris. They haven't abandoned some forts and whatnot. So they send John Jay out there to negotiate a treaty to hopefully get the British to stop practicing impressment, to stop raiding American shipping, and to keep their end of the Treaty of Paris up. So John Jay, though, he's not able to accomplish very much. It's a pretty, it's a failure pretty much of a treaty. They signed a treaty, Jay's Treaty, and they kind of agreed to stop impressment, but it's really, they agree to do everything that they were supposed to do in the beginning. There's no kind of punishment for anything that they had been doing. The only positive side to this treaty is that we do not go to war with Britain. Okay, a whiskey rebellion. A part of Alexander Hamilton's plan, he issues this whiskey tax, and it's kind of targeting farmers. So the farmers are going to be pretty upset with it. It was easier for them to transport grain, and if they changed it into liquid form, so changed it into alcohol like whiskey. And so now there's this tax on it. It's the first kind of internal tax. It's not a tariff on like exported and imported items. It's a tax on a good that we are making and consuming within the colonies. So it upsets the farmers. There's this big rebellion. George Washington ends up sending out 13,000 troops to crush this rebellion. And it happens very, very quickly. The rebellion's kind of over. Washington gives pardon to some of the leaders. He doesn't execute them. And he kind of gives the Americans these words of warning that they need to distinguish between oppression and the necessary exercise of lawful authority. Not everything that you don't like is oppression. Some of it is, necessary for us to run the country. So we can't, every time the government issues a law or a tax that the people don't like, we can't rise up in full-scale rebellion. That's just not going to work. The country is not going to survive that way. Okay, so following 2 terms, so 8 years, Washington decides to retire, and he writes his farewell address, which was printed in the newspaper. And he pretty much urges Americans to kind of lay aside their partisan divisions, meaning their party kind of divisions, You know, stop fighting each other because one of you is a Jeffersonian and the other is a Hamiltonian. We need to all just get along, and that's the only way that this is going to work. He says that we really need to cultivate commercial ties with Europe, so we need to trade with Europe, but we don't need to be politically tied up with Europe. We don't want to be dragged into every European war that happens. And pretty much this is the foundation for our basic foreign policy until the 20th century, until we get to World War I, World War II. We're pretty isolationist. We just want to mind our own business, is the point of that. Okay, so this is your SRQ. Who are the two most important leaders of the Republicans during Washington's administration? The answer is Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Question number 2. Why was Washington's proclamation of neutrality in 1793 not popular with either the Federalists or the Republicans? The answer is the Federalists tended to favor a pro-British policy and the Republicans tended to favor a pro-French one. Washington's proclamation favored neither. Question number 3. What was the most important result of Jay's Treaty? It averted war with Great Britain. Okay, this is your paragraph strength. Disagreement, policy, and strategy. Okay, you're going to have a quiz in class tomorrow going over some of this information. So just make sure that you completed your notes and you've read the section.